Welcome to today's consultation. I'm so glad you're joining us. In this explainer, I'll be stepping in as your healthcare expert to untangle the incredibly complex and, let's be honest, often contradictory science of dietary fats. We're going to dive straight into the latest clinical data, massive systematic reviews, and meta-analyses to figure out what's really going on with the food on our plates.
So are all fats truly bad for your heart? It's a question I get constantly, and it's a decades-old myth that's caused, well, a whole lot of confusion. For years, the standard advice was basically just eat low-fat everything. But as the clinical data has matured, we've learned that the real story is significantly more nuanced.
Here is our game plan for today's health assessment. We'll start with the great fat myth, then look at saturated fats, tackle trans fats, compare industrial versus natural fats, review the global fight against trans fats, and wrap up with your heart-healthy prescription.
All right, Section 1, the great fat myth, separating fact from fiction.
Before we can accurately assess your risk, we need to get our definitions straight. Saturated fats, these are the ones that are usually solid at room temperature. You know, things like butter, meats, cheese, dairy, and even tropical sources like coconut and palm oil. For the longest time, these guys were literally painted as the ultimate dietary villains.
But check this out. This quote is from a massive systematic review published in the British Medical Journal, and it completely turns that old narrative on its head. After crunching the data on hundreds of thousands of healthy adults, researchers concluded that saturated fats are actually not associated with all-cause mortality, cardiovascular disease, coronary heart disease, ischemic stroke, or type 2 diabetes. I mean, wow, right? Moving right along to Section 2, saturated fats, a complex picture, and the nutrient replacement rule. Now, does that mean you should just go ahead and eat butter by the block? Actually, scratch that. Definitely don't do that. Take a look at this number, 21%. A major Cochrane review of randomized trials found a 21% drop in combined cardiovascular events when people reduced their saturated fat intake for at least 2 years. You're probably thinking, wait a minute, didn't you just say it wasn't directly linked to heart disease? The secret here is actually all about what you swap it out for.
And that brings us to the absolute golden rule of our consultation, the nutrient replacement rule. Dropping saturated fat only helps your heart if you replace it with the right stuff. If you swap it for healthy, polyunsaturated fats like nuts, seeds, and fish, your coronary risk goes down and outcomes improve. But, and this is a huge but, if you replace saturated fat with highly processed, refined carbohydrates, your risk of cardiovascular disease actually shoots right back up. So the fat itself isn't necessarily the primary killer, it's how you balance your overall macronutrients that truly dictates your health.
Okay, Section 3, trans fats, the heart's enemy, the real culprit behind cardiovascular disease.
This is where we hit the most critical part of today's diagnosis, the undeniable, absolute danger of trans unsaturated fatty acids. I always use a simple plumbing analogy with my patients to explain this. Think of your blood vessels as your body's plumbing system. Your LDL and HDL cholesterol are essentially the delivery and garbage trucks driving through those pipes. But trans fats? They are straight-up toxic sludge. They don't just sit there peacefully, they actively damage your pipes, tank your good cholesterol, spike your bad cholesterol, and build up those inflammatory blockages that eventually lead to heart attacks.
Let's look at the hard data here. That same BMJ meta-analysis revealed some seriously alarming numbers tied to trans fat consumption. We're talking a 34% spike in all-cause mortality, a 28% increase in coronary heart disease mortality, and a 21% jump in total coronary heart disease events. The data is just unequivocal.
And here's the scariest part. It takes practically nothing to trigger these risks. Literally, just a tiny 2% absolute increase in your daily calories coming from trans fats leads to a staggering 23% increase in cardiovascular risk. To put that into perspective, 2% is just a few grams a day. You could easily knock that back in a single serving of the wrong processed snack. Let's shift to Section 4, industrial versus natural fats. Because, as it turns out, not all trans fats are created equal.
We really have to understand where these fats are actually coming from. Industrial trans fats are entirely man-made. Manufacturers take liquid vegetable oils and basically bombard them with hydrogen to make them solid. These are the ones strongly tied to that massive heart disease risk we just talked about. On the flip side, we have ruminant trans fats. These occur naturally in very low levels in meat and dairy from animals like cows and sheep. And you know what? Current data shows no clear association between those low, naturally occurring levels and heart disease. It's the manufactured stuff that's driving the epidemic.
So as your healthcare expert, I need you to know exactly where this industrial sludge is hiding. Generally speaking, it's lurking in products engineered for a really long shelf life. We're talking stick margarine, commercial shortenings, deep-fried fast food, store-bought baked goods like cakes and pies, various packaged crackers, and partially hydrogenated vegetable oils, like Vanaspati ghee, which is super common in South Asia.
Which brings us to Section 5, the global fight against trans fats and how health policies save lives.
When you look at the global data, there is a really stark contrast in how different countries handle this. Notice how in places like Denmark, Switzerland, and Australia, where they enacted near-total bans on industrial trans fats, estimated intake absolutely plummeted to under 2%. Historically in the US, with a slower phase-out and labeling approach, it sat around 2 to 3%. But in parts of the Middle East and South Asia, where regulations have been much looser, that intake can soar up to 7%. It just goes to show, when governments step in, intake drops dramatically.
And that translates into incredible real-world results. Get this, Denmark saw an unbelievable 60% decrease in cardiovascular disease risk after their government stepped in to heavily restrict trans fats in the food supply. Policy absolutely works. Getting this sludge out of our dietary plumbing literally saves lives.
Finally, we've arrived at Section 6, your heart-healthy prescription. Let's get into some actionable steps for your diet.
The World Health Organization is super clear on this. Their official prescription is to limit your total trans fat intake to less than 1% of your total daily energy. Now, remember what we said earlier about those natural ruminant fats? To hit this 1% target, you don't actually need to completely eliminate all trans fats, since small amounts are totally natural in dairy and meat. But aggressively cutting out those industrial variants, that is absolutely mandatory for your heart health. So how do we actually do that in the real world? Next time you're at the grocery store, just follow these 3 simple steps. Step 1, completely ignore those front-of-package marketing claims. A box can legally brag about having 0 trans fat, even if it has up to half a gram per serving. Step 2, flip the box over and read the actual ingredient list on the back. And step 3, if you see the words partially hydrogenated oils, put the product right back on the shelf immediately. That is your red flag. Doing this will keep your cardiovascular plumbing clear of hidden trans fats.
I want to leave you with a slightly provocative thought. Knowing that even a tiny 2% bump in calories from trans fats can spike your cardiovascular risk by 23%, what kind of industrial sludge might be hiding on your pantry shelves right now? Seriously, I urge you to go check your own food labels as soon as this explainer is over. Thank you so much for joining me today, and hey, here's to your cardiovascular health.